Elijah Beckett stood silently at the edge of the dam, the lever in his hand, and 35 homes below, built on land that was never theirs. The HOA called him a crazy old man. They didn't know the storm was coming, or that he held the blueprint that could wash away everything they built with a single turn. Elijah Beckett had lived a quiet life tucked away in Pine Creek Valley, a forgotten speck of green hills and old water lines about 2 hours outside of the city. His grandfather had built the original Pine Creek Dam back in 1951, a marvel at the time, and the land around it had been passed down from father to son like a sacred inheritance. Elijah, now 54, wasn't wealthy, but he was precise. He kept his land clean, his maps up to date, and his promises sacred. The 160 acres that wrapped around the old dry lake bed and dam were his sanctuary. He grew apples. He kept bees. He never caused trouble. That's why the sound of bulldozers one morning in early spring stopped him cold. It wasn't uncommon for trucks to drive by, but these weren't passing. They were working. When he walked to the top of the northern ridge, binoculars in hand, his heart dropped. Trees were being cleared. His trees. Survey flags lined up across the valley floor. Men in bright vests measured and hammered. Asphalt trucks waited on the gravel road that had once led to his trout pond. At first, he thought it had to be a mistake. He drove down the dusty road to the edge of the chaos and waved down a man in a hard hat. The foreman barely looked at him. "This is a private construction zone, sir," the man said. "I know," Elijah replied calmly, holding up a deed. "You're on my land." The foreman chuckled and shook his head. "Nope. This is Briar Hills Phase 3, fully zoned and permitted by the county. Maybe check with them." Elijah's brow furrowed. "There's no Phase 3, and those permits are forgeries." "Then sue us," the foreman snapped, turning back toward the site. Elijah did. He took his thick folder of documents, his grandfather's blueprints, old county zoning maps, aerial photos, and drove straight to the county office. But when he presented everything to the clerk, a man named Peter Hensley, he was told something that made no sense. "Mr. Beckett, according to the latest records, that parcel now belongs to the Briar Hills Homeowners Association. The survey lines were updated last year." Elijah blinked. "That land has been in my family for 3 generations." "I'm sorry, sir," Hensley said, clearly avoiding his gaze. "But unless you have newer documentation than this, there's nothing I can do." Later, he found out Hensley was the brother-in-law of Dwayne Kelmer, the president of the Briar Hills HOA. And Dwayne Kelmer had a reputation, slick-back hair, expensive suits, and a long trail of quietly buried lawsuits. Within weeks, Elijah watched the valley transform. His orchards were uprooted, roads paved, foundations poured. His name meant nothing. He hired a local attorney, but the case was quickly dismissed. Then another, same result. The system seemed closed to him. The worst part wasn't the theft. It was how they made him invisible. Homeowners moved into their cookie-cutter homes, smiling and waving as if the ground beneath them wasn't stolen. Kids rode bikes where he once caught fireflies. Sprinklers watered lawns above buried irrigation pipes he had laid by hand. At night, he sat in his cabin, his grandfather's rolled-up blueprints unspooled on the table, a cup of cold coffee untouched beside him. He knew what lay under those houses, what the HOA had ignored when they buried the truth. He wasn't crazy, he wasn't helpless. They just hadn't realized who they'd stolen from. Elijah Beckett spent the next several weeks in a haze of disbelief and bitter clarity. The valley he once knew had become unrecognizable. Every morning, the sound of drills and concrete mixers echoed through the hills. He would walk the perimeter of what was left of his land, noting every new driveway, every mailbox staked into soil he'd once tilled himself. It wasn't just about land anymore. It was about being erased, about having your family's legacy paved over without a whisper of acknowledgement. He started documenting everything: photos, dates, drone footage. He scrawled meticulous notes in a leather-bound ledger, detailing each home's construction and the exact historical plotline it violated. At night, he traced old boundary maps over the new satellite images, highlighting the overlap with red marker. Every time he found a new encroachment, his chest tightened with a mixture of helpless rage and resolve. But Elijah wasn't the type to rage loudly. He'd learned the art of silence from his father, who had taught him how to listen to the land, to see danger in a trickle of water before it became a flood. He turned to that training now, focusing his anger into something deliberate. The turning point came on a Tuesday afternoon when he stopped by the town library to search for old land records. That's where he met Justine Morales. She was 27, sharp-eyed, and in her third year of law school, working part-time as an archival assistant. Elijah didn't expect much. He had been brushed off too many times by city workers with fake smiles, but Justine surprised him. She saw his stack of maps, the hand-marked pages, the crisp original deeds, and her expression shifted. "You said they built over the dam's emergency channel?" she asked, frowning as she traced a finger over a blueprint from 1951. "Yes," Elijah said quietly. "They sealed the access shaft. Probably thought it was an old irrigation well. That tunnel is what kept the valley from flooding in '72. It's still functional. Barely. But they don't know that." Justine looked up. "And they never checked?" "They never cared." She leaned back in her chair, lips pursed. "This could be big. If the homes are on top of a known flood bypass system and no mitigation was done, they're not just on it, they sealed it. That's criminal negligence." Her eyes lit with something Elijah hadn't seen in anyone else in months. Belief. Not just belief in the story, but in the fight. "I'll help you," she said. "We can't go back to the same local court. Kelmer's got the judge in his pocket. But I know a way to file in federal court. Environmental misrepresentation, floodplain endangerment, and land misappropriation. I'll pull every string I've got." For the first time in nearly a year, Elijah allowed himself a small breath of hope. Over the next few days, they worked in secret. They scanned documents, photographed hand-drawn maps, and uploaded video evidence of the buried tunnel shaft. Justine found an obscure federal clause about legacy infrastructure and public safety risks, something the HOA had failed to declare. Together they compiled a case, raw but explosive. The key was proving the HOA acted with deliberate disregard, not just error. And for that, they needed more than maps. They needed people, witnesses. Elijah visited the new residence under the guise of a friendly old man curious about the new neighborhood. He complimented gardens and handed out jars of his wildflower honey. He listened, smiled, and waited for someone to mention cracks in their basement walls, strange drain backups, or odd water smells. It didn't take long. One woman, Nancy Kilgore, told him her patio had sunk slightly on one side. "Probably settling," she shrugged. "New builds, you know." Elijah just smiled and nodded. He didn't tell her that her home sat directly over the tunnel's access channel. He didn't say the sink was just the beginning. Not yet, because truth, like water, always finds its way, and soon the storm would come. Justine worked late into the night, often messaging Elijah past midnight with links, scanned documents, and carefully crafted legal drafts. She had reached out to her former environmental law professor, who quietly offered guidance. With his help, they filed a formal injunction request at the federal level, bypassing the local court system entirely. It was a long shot, but it was something. Still, Elijah knew it wouldn't stop the HOA immediately. In the meantime, the construction frenzy continued. The HOA was racing against time. More homes were being completed. Families were moving in. Flags with Briar Hills, Phase 3. Luxury living waved proudly from street lamps. Elijah felt the weight of every passing day like a ticking clock echoing inside his chest. He started going through his grandfather's journals again, handwritten notes, yellowed blueprints, and margin sketches. There were pages on water flow angles, seepage models, and pressure calculations. And then something caught his eye, an entry dated August 1972, a month after the major storm that almost wiped out the valley. It read, "Should the main channel ever be sealed, pressure will climb. Without the bypass tunnel, the dam could collapse under extreme rainfall. Emergency valve must remain operational, otherwise catastrophic release will occur." Elijah stared at the sentence for a long time. The HOA hadn't just built on a floodplain, they had turned the valley into a bomb. He printed the page and handed it to Justine the next morning. She paled reading it. "If we can prove they covered that tunnel deliberately and ignored the hydrology data, this becomes more than civil. This is criminal endangerment." The two of them drafted an emergency letter to FEMA and the Army Corps of Engineers. Justine found a whistleblower contact at the Department of Environmental Protection. But the gears of government turned slowly, and they knew the next major storm might not wait. Then came the HOA's retaliation. Elijah received a notice from the sheriff's department, a restraining order filed by the HOA against him for ongoing harassment, trespassing, and intentional damage to property. "They're trying to shut you up," Justine said, clenching the paper. "They want to paint you as unstable." He nodded. "Let him. The truth doesn't need to scream." But the campaign against him escalated. Flyers appeared in mailboxes around the new neighborhood, warning residents of Elijah's unstable behavior and unsubstantiated conspiracy theories. His old truck was keyed, the tires slashed. One night, someone even threw a brick through his cabin window with a note taped to it. "We built. You lost. Move on." Still, Elijah didn't stop. He quietly installed a wildlife camera in the woods, overlooking the back of the new homes, just above the buried emergency tunnel. Days later, he reviewed the footage and caught something startling. A construction crew had returned and poured concrete over the last visible portion of the bypass shaft. They were sealing it completely. He brought the footage to Justine. Her voice trembled with rage. They know, and they're hiding it." Together, they updated the federal filing with the new evidence. That same day, Justine received a call from a contact in D.C. "We're watching it closely," the woman on the other end said. "But without immediate threat, it's still just paper. Unless there's imminent danger, we can't act yet." Elijah looked out the window. The sky had turned gray over Pine Creek Valley. The first droplets tapped the tin roof of his porch. Rain was coming. And if the forecasts were right, it wouldn't stop for days. The rain arrived with a whisper, soft and steady, like a warning in the wind. Elijah stood at the edge of the bluff above his cabin, hood pulled over his head, watching the first rivulets of water snake down the hillside. The air felt different, thicker, tense, the kind of atmosphere that made animals go still and silent. Storm systems like this weren't common in Pine Creek Valley, but when they did come, the valley didn't forget. The scars of 1972 still ran deep in Elijah's family lore. His grandfather had saved the town back then by opening the dam's bypass tunnel just in time. But that tunnel, the same one now buried beneath concrete and luxury driveways, had been their lifeline. By the second day, the rain was relentless. Sheets of it slammed the ground, and the narrow roads turned into shallow streams. Elijah monitored the dam constantly, checking the gauges and spillover indicators his grandfather had installed decades ago. The water level had already risen 2 feet above normal. He knew the structure's tolerances by heart. In the cabin, Justine was at the table, soaked from her drive out, typing frantically on her laptop. She had tried to reach the local emergency services, the city council, even the state water commission. No one answered. Everyone was waiting it out. "Elijah," she said, spinning the screen toward him. Look at this. No AA just issued a flood watch. 5 to 8 more inches expected by tomorrow. He leaned over, eyes narrowing. That'll breach the eastern edge of the dam, especially if the tunnel stays sealed. And they're still doing nothing, she said, her voice sharp. They think you're just some crazy hillman screaming about ghosts in the ground. But this, she clicked on a map overlay. This is science. This is fact. Elijah didn't answer immediately. He walked to a cabinet and pulled out a long wooden case. Inside it lay the original steel lever from the dam's control chamber, disconnected years ago when it was replaced with a motorized system. But Elijah had preserved it like an heirloom. Slowly, deliberately, he turned it in his hands. What are you thinking? Justine asked. He looked at her, calm but grave. If that pressure hits a certain threshold, the dam won't break. It'll explode. Not just flood damage, structural failure. People could die. The words hung in the room like fog. The next morning, Elijah made the hike through the forest to the control house perched above the dam. Rain pounded the roof like a drumline, and every step felt heavier than the last. The old iron gate creaked open, and inside, the control board flickered to life. He ran diagnostics. The bypass valve registered, closed, and locked. The tunnel, if not completely filled, was at least blocked enough to prevent any significant diversion. Pressure sensors blinked red, elevated. Dangerously so. Elijah called Justine. It's worse than I thought. There's backflow pressure coming from the lower valve. They poured concrete into the access channel, but the backup is forcing it to bulge. If that seal breaks from the inside, the water won't just seep out. It'll burst. Can you release it manually? She asked. He hesitated. Not from here, not anymore. There was only one way left. He had to reach the auxiliary release crank, the last remaining manual failsafe, hidden beneath the old stone platform, just past the tree line. His grandfather had shown it to him once, as a child, during a thunderstorm not unlike this one. The mountain keeps secrets, his grandfather had said, but only from the ones who don't listen. By the evening, residents in Briar Hills were noticing something was off. Basements started to flood. Toilets gurgled. Patches of grass turned into soggy ponds. Elijah's phone buzzed with a text from Nancy Kilgore, the woman with the sinking patio. Something's wrong. Water's coming up through the floor. Please help. He didn't reply. Not yet. He needed more proof. At 10:42 p.m., he reviewed the wildlife camera footage again. In the hazy night vision, streams of water were flowing uphill, unnatural, forced through cracks in the ground under pressure. Then came the final confirmation, a muffled thump beneath the soil, a plume of mist bursting from the grass, and one of the homes visibly shaking. The seal was buckling, and Elijah knew the time for warnings was over. Now it was action, or disaster. Elijah barely slept that night. He kept his boots on, flashlight beside his cot. Raincoat hung at the ready. The storm hadn't let up for even a minute. By 4 a.m., the cabin walls trembled slightly with every gust of wind. Thunder rolled through the valley like distant cannon fire. The air smelled of wet earth and something electric, something old and heavy, like history waking up beneath the hills. He checked the dam levels again. The readings on his handheld gauge were alarming. Water had risen nearly 4 more feet. The runoff from the mountains was pouring directly into the reservoir, which had no outlet now that the bypass tunnel was sealed. The emergency overflow was clogged with construction debris, fragments of piping, broken PVC, insulation. By dawn, it wasn't a question of whether something would fail. It was a question of when. Elijah climbed to the overlook trail with his tools and the steel control key, slipping and stumbling through mud and roots, slick with rain. The auxiliary valve was tucked inside a stone housing built into the cliffside, almost entirely overgrown. It was the last functioning manual failsafe, a kind of flood release known only to his family and never registered on any official map. He knelt before the metal plate, pried it open with a crowbar, and exposed the rusted mechanism beneath. He inserted the key. It fit perfectly. For a moment, he just stared at it, rain running down his face, water roaring in the distance. If he turned it now, the tunnel would flood, fast. It wouldn't destroy the houses above, but it would destabilize their foundations. That alone would bring federal attention. But if he didn't open it, and the pressure cracked the dam, he wouldn't be able to live with the deaths. His hands gripped the key. He exhaled once. Then he turned. The first sound was like a giant sucking breath. Then came a deep rumble from under his feet. The ancient tunnel began to fill. Water surged forward with a roar, pulled by gravity and pressure that had built over days. The hillside vibrated, trees quivering like tuning forks. Elijah watched the earth tremble, but he didn't flinch. This wasn't sabotage. This was correction. Back in the neighborhood, chaos had erupted. Homeowners stumbled into the stormy morning to find their driveways splitting, manhole covers lifted, and brown water erupting from storm drains. Nancy Kilgore's entire patio had collapsed. A few homes experienced sudden sinkholes beneath their garages. Someone called 911, screaming about, "The earth eating my house." Emergency services arrived, but were overwhelmed. As power flickered across the neighborhood, someone finally called the news. Helicopters were deployed, and Elijah was still there, standing at the mouth of the tunnel, soaked to the bone, mud on his hands. His grandfather's blueprint clutched in a plastic sleeve under his coat. Justine called him. "It's happening," she said. Her voice was breathless. "They're live on national news right now. FEMA's on standby. I just got a call from the EPA asking for verification of the tunnel's history. Elijah, they're listening. Finally." He nodded silently. For him, it wasn't about revenge. It was about the truth cracking through the concrete lies. Later that morning, the federal response teams arrived in full force. Drones surveyed the damage. Engineers examined the shifting foundations and immediately identified structural violations. But the breakthrough came when they tested water flow and discovered the old tunnel system. Buried, yes, but intact and functional. One of the agents, a seasoned hydrologist, approached Elijah on the dam. "You kept the system alive. You opened it just in time. If you hadn't..." He trailed off. "There'd be no Briar Hills left." Elijah didn't answer. He looked out at the water, now rushing cleanly through the old spillway and out to the marshes beyond. He whispered, mostly to himself, "The land remembers, even when people forget." And deep in the ground, the valley exhaled. By the next day, the media had descended on Pine Creek Valley like a wave. News vans lined the narrow roads, drones buzzed overhead, and reporters in raincoats stood in front of half-sunken homes, speaking breathlessly into microphones. A mysterious underground flood channel, an unsung local hero, a whistleblower law student, and an HOA scandal now under federal investigation, one anchor said with a mix of awe and suspense. But Elijah didn't watch the news. He sat quietly on the porch of his cabin, sipping hot tea and listening to the dripping branches. For the first time in days, the rain had stopped. The sky was beginning to clear. The smell of wet pine and fresh earth filled the air. Justine arrived around noon, her car tires crunching in the gravel, face exhausted but triumphant. She held up her phone, showing him the live feed. "You're the top story in the entire state," she said, voice shaking with adrenaline. "They're calling you the Flood Keeper." Elijah gave a tired chuckle. "Better than what they were calling me last week." She sat beside him. "They're launching a full audit of the HOA. Every home in Phase 3 is now under review. The Environmental Crimes Unit is tearing through records. And get this, 3 of the contractors have already confessed to knowing the floodplain data and ignoring it for kickbacks." He turned to her slowly. "How many knew?" She exhaled. "At least 7 people in key positions, 2 on the city zoning board, 1 judge, multiple HOA officers. Kelmer, he's going down hard. And the funny part is, the very thing they mocked you for, your maps, your notes, your blueprints, is what saved their lives. For the first time in a long while, Elijah let that truth settle inside him, not as satisfaction, but as closure. Later that afternoon, federal engineers and a FEMA director named Alicia Carmichael hiked up to Elijah's cabin. She was tall, silver-haired, and had the calm presence of someone who had stood in the aftermath of real disasters. "You opened the tunnel when no one else even knew it was there," she said simply. "That's not just brave, that's historic." She handed him a document, an official certification transferring the entirety of the disputed land, including the homes and roads, back under his name. "Until the courts finish prosecuting the fraud cases, you are the sole recognized owner of Briar Hills Phase 3. And I suggest you get yourself a lawyer with a good suit. A lot of people are about to make you a lot of offers." Elijah looked down at the paper, then out toward the distant rooftops peeking over the hills. "I don't want money," he said. "I want honesty, and I want those families safe." "You'll get both," Alicia replied, "because you just turned a private crime into a public reckoning." In the days that followed, Elijah walked through the neighborhood again. This time, no one slammed their doors. No one looked away. Nancy Kilgore approached him with tears in her eyes. "I said awful things about you. I even signed that petition to get you banned, but you saved my children, and I can't ever repay that." "You just did," Elijah said gently. Children waved to him from their porches. One boy ran up and handed him a drawing. It was the dam, with Elijah standing beside it like a superhero. He smiled and tucked it into his coat pocket. Justine soon received word that her work on the case had led to a full scholarship and job offers from 3 law firms, but she turned them all down. "I think I'm going to start my own practice," she said one morning, grinning. "Pro bono, HOA fraud, environmental whistleblowers, land rights. You in?" Elijah nodded. "If I say yes, do I get business cards?" "You'll get your face on a billboard," she said, laughing. And so the man once called crazy became a symbol of justice, not because he wanted revenge, but because he knew how to listen to the land when no one else would. The federal investigation into the Briar Hills HOA grew faster than anyone had anticipated. What started as a local zoning scandal unraveled into a sweeping web of fraud, bribery, and environmental neglect. Subpoenas landed on the desks of zoning officials, building inspectors, and real estate agents. Several of them cracked under pressure and offered full cooperation, revealing years of hidden deals and falsified documents. Dwayne Kelmer, the HOA president, was arrested on multiple charges: conspiracy to commit fraud, endangerment of public safety, bribery, and falsifying environmental clearance reports. His mugshot was broadcast nationwide. Gone was the smug, confident man in custom suits. Now he looked small and panicked, clutching his briefcase like a lifeline as cameras flashed. Back in Pine Creek Valley, Elijah remained at the center of it all, but he refused to become a spectacle. When a national news station offered him a paid interview, he declined. When a book agent reached out, he ignored the email. All he wanted was to rebuild trust with the land, with the community, and with himself. Still, his presence had become legendary. People drove in from neighboring counties to meet the man who saved a town with a blueprint and a lever. Some brought letters, others brought baked goods. One elderly couple even offered him a purebred dog as a gift of thanks. Elijah politely declined the dog, but let it sit beside him on the porch for a while, scratching behind its ears. One afternoon, Nancy Kilgore invited him to a community meeting. This time, hosted not by the corrupt HOA, but by the residents themselves. It was held in a converted barn just off Briar Hills Lane. As Elijah stepped through the doors, every person in the room stood and began to clap. He wasn't used to applause. He stood still, heart thudding in his chest, unsure of how to respond. Nancy led him to the front where a boy handed him a microphone. "We thought we knew what this neighborhood was," she said to the crowd. "But it was built on stolen land, stolen trust, and buried danger. And we didn't see it because we didn't want to. But this man, he saw it all and warned us. And when we didn't listen, he saved us anyway." The room was silent as Elijah raised the microphone, his voice low and steady. "I didn't do it for applause," he said. "I did it because my grandfather taught me to protect this land, because truth doesn't vanish just because someone paves over it, and because sometimes doing the right thing means being willing to be hated for a while." There were tears in the audience. Even some of the contractors who had once ignored him now sat with lowered heads, ashamed. After the meeting, a small group approached him. Young parents, teachers, retirees. They wanted his guidance on forming a new community leadership council, one based on transparency, environmental responsibility, and open decision-making. Elijah smiled softly. "Start by listening to the people who never had a voice in the first place." With Justine's help, they began to draft a new community charter. They invited Elijah to help oversee land management and water safety. His knowledge, once dismissed as old-fashioned, was now seen as essential. He walked the hills again with a different feeling in his chest. Not the loneliness of a man displaced, but the stillness of a man returning home. The wind through the pines no longer sounded like mourning. It sounded like music. And every time he passed the dam, he touched the stone wall gently, almost like greeting an old friend. The lever was locked again, the tunnel now fully mapped, reinforced, and officially protected under federal law. The mountain no longer kept secrets, and neither did he. Spring returned to Pine Creek Valley with an almost poetic sense of timing. The hills, once scarred by machines and lined with unfinished driveways, were now dotted with wildflowers. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the sound of construction had been replaced by the laughter of children and the quiet murmur of rebuilding. Not rebuilding the homes, they still stood, but the rebuilding of something deeper: trust, history, community. Elijah Beckett stood at the edge of the overlook, the same spot where he had once watched in silent heartbreak as his family's land was stolen, repackaged, and sold without a second thought. Now he watched something very different. Down below, volunteers gathered near the newly renovated community center. It had once been the HOA office. Now it served as the new hub for the neighborhood council, free of politics and corruption. A banner hung above its doors: "Welcome to Beckett Falls." They had voted unanimously to rename the development in his family's honor. Elijah had objected at first, but Justine had taken his hand and said, "It's not about pride. It's about truth. This name is a reminder of what was saved and who saved it." As he descended the trail, people waved to him with smiles that no longer held hesitation or pity. There was respect now, earned not through wealth or title, but through quiet courage and the willingness to do what others wouldn't. Inside the center, the council had prepared a small ceremony. Justine stood at the front, holding a framed copy of the original dam blueprint, restored, laminated, and mounted under glass. "This," she said, "was the beginning. And it took 50 years, one storm, and one very persistent man to show us its value." Ooh. She turned to Elijah, smiling. "Would you do the honor?" He stepped forward and gently placed the blueprint on the wall beside a brass plaque that read, "To Elijah Beckett, whose hands opened the dam and whose heart held the valley together." The room erupted in applause, but Elijah simply lowered his head and whispered, "For grandfather." Later, as the gathering spilled outside into the sunlit field, Justine pulled Elijah aside. She looked tired but happy. "I've officially opened my law practice," she said. "First case is next month. HOA corruption in Arizona. They want me to testify in D.C. eventually. Think I should go?" Elijah smiled. Absolutely. Just don't forget your boots. I never will, she said. Before leaving, Justine handed him a manila envelope. Inside was a court document signed by a federal judge. It formally declared the land beneath Beckett Falls as environmentally protected heritage territory. No one can ever build here without public oversight again. You made sure of that. Elijah felt a quiet peace settle over him. The weight that had sat on his chest for over a year now felt lifted, like the valley itself was breathing easier. That evening, he returned home to his cabin and sat on the porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The dam, in the distance, glistened under the golden light. The emergency tunnel had a new steel grate, the sensor system upgraded, and a digital monitor installed, all donated by FEMA as part of a nationwide awareness campaign. It was now the subject of engineering case studies in 3 universities. A gentle knock on his door broke the silence. It was Nancy Kilgore, holding a casserole and her 2 children. "We thought you might be hungry," she said, smiling nervously. He welcomed them in. The children ran to the fireplace and sat cross-legged on the rug. Nancy placed the food on the counter and looked around. "It's peaceful here," she said. "I can see why you never wanted to leave." Elijah nodded. "Some places are meant to hold stories, not just people." Before she left, her daughter handed him a small box wrapped in paper. Inside was a tiny clay model of the dam, hand-painted and surprisingly detailed. On the base, a message was scratched in a child's handwriting. "Thank you for saving us." Elijah held it in his palm for a long moment. Outside, the stars began to bloom over the valley, and as he leaned back in his chair, the cool breeze rustling the trees, he finally closed his eyes. Not in exhaustion, but in peace. The mountain had remembered, and now so had everyone else. In my view, the ending of this story speaks not only to justice, but to the deeper healing that can come from standing firm in the face of silence and corruption. Elijah Beckett isn't a hero in the traditional sense. He's quiet, ordinary, even overlooked. But that's what makes his victory so profound. He didn't fight for fame or revenge. He fought for memory, for truth, for the sacred connection between a family and the land they tended for generations. What makes the conclusion especially powerful is how it turns a heavy, painful narrative into a redemptive one, not through destruction, but through restoration. Elijah didn't destroy the people who wronged him. He revealed them, and then he built something better in their place. He turned a stolen legacy into a shared one, allowing even those who once hated or ignored him to be part of something honest and lasting. It's a story about how water, like truth, always finds its way, and how one man's quiet strength can shift an entire valley. The final image of Elijah at peace, the valley breathing easy once more, is not just satisfying, it's deeply earned.